Let's see what's going on in the world today. That's weird. Who do I know in the plus 44 calling code? That's that stripper again. I'm gonna seriously consider telling her I'm married one day. Hello? Hello, Ryan. How are you? Haven't heard from you in a while. How have things been? I've been busy. There's been lots of stuff breaking down all over the place, not just you. No worries, no worries. Hey, perhaps you want to ride on Hyperia? That'd be great. Did you get your lift hill all fixed up there? Yeah, we got it all fixed up. Why don't you come on over? Is that a train stopped at Lift Park? No, nothing to worry about. Just a minor fault, I can assure you. Come on over. Hey, are your trains running kinda slow? No, they're running fine, thank you very much. They're not running slow at all. That's crazy. Did you just valley a train? No. Okay, look, I can explain. Why can't this run consistent? Call waiting? Who could that be? Ha ha! Can't keep it going around the track, huh? Looks like you need some more speed. Maybe you want some of my stators? You need wheels to valley a train in case you haven't noticed. Hey guys, who wants to ride? Ride me all night long. That's not good. Are you drunk? No, you're drunk. You're drunk and you're wobbly. You're not standing still. That looks like a crap ride to me. Hey, what was your throughput last week? That's what I thought. Even drunk, I'm better than he is. Let's talk about speeding trains up.
Now get ready. Here we go.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Ryan Ride Mechanic channel. How the heck are you doing today? Today's video I wanted to address a little bit of an issue that I've seen over the past bit of time in regards to, well, we're going to use Hyperia in this case since it's just out there in the open for us all to see. And I wanted to talk a bit about slow trains and what we can do to fix that. Okay, it may seem like a weird topic, but there is a fine line that these trains have to walk. You have to make the train fast enough to get around the course. Of course, if you can't make the train fast enough, it will valley, kind of like happened to Hyperia. It happens all the time. It happens to roller coasters all over for all sorts of different reasons. So when we're working with roller coasters, we know this speed. We say, that's too slow, that's too fast, and you have to keep the train in that window. But that window is not really well defined. There's nothing like from the manufacturer that says, hey, look, it's got to be in this window. It's kind of all like passed down knowledge. Some ride systems do produce faults if the train is either too fast or too slow. But there are plenty of rides that don't do that. There's no fault monitoring at all if the train is going too fast or too slow. So what are some of the things that we have to consider for this? Well, we've got to look at several things which include like the track layout, the design of the train, weather conditions. These are all big factors when it comes to the speed of the train. So when the manufacturer designed the ride, they designed the ride a specific way to go a certain speed. And it was recently brought up to me. So I was talking with another engineer about speed and its forces and implications it has on that train. And he brought up a very good subject, which was basically, he said, hey, you don't think about this, but the trim brakes and stuff like that are installed throughout the ride, like every once in a while you run those trims and slow them down. He says that may be because of the restraints, not because of the track and structure or the train. He says that could be because of the restraints, and there's a good reason for that. Because when they're designing the restraint system of the ride, the restraint system has to meet a certain standard. There's different classes, class 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 level restraints. So, a mild ride, something that doesn't require hardly anything, is like a class 1 restraint. And these big, crazy rides out there, like we use something like X2 out there at Magic Mountain. X2 has like I don't know for sure. People can probably correct me in the comments if I'm wrong, but I would assume X2 has a class 5 restraint because that thing tries to buck you out of its seat as much as it can. So what he was telling me is like, hey, when the ride is slowed down and we use the trim brakes to slow that ride down, you might be trying to keep the forces on the rider within a certain little tiny window. And that little tiny window allows that ride to use a class 3 restraint, which they've put on that ride. But one thing we don't quite think about, if that train goes too fast, it will jump into a class 4 and then the restraints are under-designed. Now that's not the case with every single ride. A lot of rides out there use the trim brakes for slowing down to make sure that the forces on the train and the track and structure are within their little parameters, and also the rider as well. Not so much the restraint, but so much the forces on the rider. But that is in the case of overspeed, which we're really not talking about here. Here we're talking about underspeed, when the ride goes too slow. So what are conditions that can get the ride to go too slow? Mainly this is caused by two things. It's friction on the track and friction in the wheel assemblies. So friction on the track, we're going to talk about a dry track. Tracks need track lube in order to let the train run around there. Most trains have urethane or rubber wheels on top of a steel rail. There is a lot of friction there. And you say, well, it's not that much, the wheel rolls. It's like there's a lot of friction there because you have those rubber wheels times 96, right? All the way back. We've got wheels all over the place. So there's a lot of drag and friction just in the wheel friction to the track surface itself. So we have to lubricate that. So lack of lubrication can mean that friction all comes back, which makes the train run slower because there's too much friction now. The same token, if you were to wet the track down, people think it goes really fast, and it does go really fast, but the wheels actually start to hydroplane in the water. What's a hydroplaning roller coaster wheel mean to anybody? That means that as the wheel is going along, the wheel stops as it starts to hydroplane. You actually lose momentum in the wheel. And then suddenly, in the high G-force areas, when that urethane decides to bite into the track again, now you have a stopped wheel going 40 miles an hour. And that takes a chunk of speed out of it when it happens. So friction to the track, very important. So we want to keep that low. Then there's other environmental aspects which we also have to take into account. So things like weather. We talked about rain just now, but you have to think about things like the hot and cold air temperature outside. When it's hot outside, the vehicles run fast. When it's cold, they run slow. Why does it run slow when it's cold? Good question. Probably recognize this guy, right? This is a wheel bearing. They're found in lots of roller coasters, this exact same little wheel bearing right here. This is a pretty small wheel, but these bearings are sealed roller bearings. By sealed, I mean right here, there is a black seal on both sides of this bearing that keep things like water and dust and debris out of that bearing surface on the inside, but it also keeps the grease inside of it so it can't get out. What's the problem with that? Is that typically you can't specify what type of grease goes in here. We looked at doing this one time. We used tons of these bearings, and we said, you know what, we want the train to run faster, so we want a lighter grease inside there. I did a whole episode on grease, right? What's lightweight grease mean? Well, some grease, you can imagine it between your hands. It's tacky, it's thick, and it's just really squishy. It's like toothpaste in your hand. It's like, okay, that's a heavy grease. Other grease is very lightweight. Imagine whipped cream in your hand. You have toothpaste in one hand, whipped cream in the other hand. the bearings, the balls that run on the inside of that run much faster through that whipped cream than they would through that toothpaste. Is that a good analogy? Okay, ice cream is not going into this at all. Neither is Dippin' Dots. Why do we always go back to Dippin' Dots on these videos? We got to stop doing this. Okay, so you want to put light grease inside of these bearings to get them to go faster. The lighter the grease, the more it moves out of the way of that bearing, the faster the bearing goes. Now, we could also do another thing, which is we could put less grease inside of a bearing, but all of these don't apply to these bearings because they're sealed. We contacted the manufacturer and said, hey, can we put our own grease inside of there? If we send you grease, can you put it inside your bearing? And they said, absolutely. It's like, great, what's that cost? It was like 6 times the cost per bearing. We were just like, no. We hung up the phone. Click. Done with that conversation. So a lot of times what happens is we use bigger bearings on bigger roller coasters. Now this is really where the service comes in. So let's talk about that. You see this bearing right here? So that bearing right there, okay? This bearing right here is a tapered roller bearing that's out of a wooden roller coaster. There's the race. This is called the cone. Okay, the cone is what actually houses the rollers on the inside. So on wooden roller coasters where we want the ultimate like no friction in there, we actually use oil in these wheels. Now, the oil gets out of the way really quick, so it's nice and lightweight, but we can also control that. We could put 30 weight oil in there. When the coaster starts running too slow, we can, what we used to do is we added automatic transmission fluid inside with the 30 weight oil, and it thinned the oil right out and allowed this bearing to run faster and faster and faster. Now for the bigger roller coasters, the big steel guys like a B&M roller coaster or something, they use a similar type bearing, but instead of it being rollers, it's basically this guy, this size. It is a ball bearing, and it uses balls in there. And what we do on those is we will use a grease syringe, which is, if you think of a syringe, a grease syringe is the exact same thing, but we use the needle and stick it down in between the rollers or the bearings, and we disperse grease inside of there. Now you're saying, why would you do that? Well, in auto shop, many years ago when I was taught how to pack wheel bearings to a car, they said this is what you do. You take the cone like this and you put a big clump of grease in your hand, and then you just take that little opening right there and you basically just start eating that chunk of grease out with it. And then when all that grease came through to the other side and started squirting out this little tiny opening, that bearing was considered packed. You had to do it all the way around, and then at the end you took some grease and went all the way around the outside, and you put it in its race in the wheel, and you put it together, you were done. Okay, roller coasters, if you were to do that, and you pack this bearing 100%, that's what we call 100% pack. If you did 100% pack bearing of grease and put this on there, you will valley that train the next time it goes around the track. Okay, because there's too much grease. It's too thick. It's in the way. So what we do is we can do a partial pack. So the manufacturer a lot of times has figured out how much grease this bearing is supposed to hold. And then in their manual, they tell you how much grease you're supposed to put in there. A lot of the bigger bearings like this required about 20 to 35 cc's worth of grease put in there. It's really not much. If you think about that and you just kind of take a handful of grease and just wipe it on the outside of the bearing in this case, that is considered packed. Nothing in between it, just the outside. That's considered packed by most manufacturers. Typically, with these wheels, and a lot of manufacturers, they do not have grease ports to add grease into the wheel. Once you pack those bearings and put the wheel together, that's it, it's done. I know a lot of B&M wheels have grease fittings on them. It's kind of dangerous because you can get mechanics out there that just get grease happy and they just start pumping grease into those wheels, and next thing you know, that train starts running slower and slower and slower. How do you fix that? You have to take the wheels apart, take the bearing out and clean it back down to nothing, and then repack it with the proper amount of grease, put the wheel back together. Doing that to one wheel takes about 45 minutes to service one wheel. And remember, there's 96 of them on the train. So we don't want to do that. When it comes to slow trains, you really want to make sure that you're on top of your grease game. So let's talk about Hyperia. What are some of the things that Hyperia can do to speed its train up? Well, there's a good chance that those wheel carriers are already set on the side friction. And by the side friction, what I mean is that the guide wheels on those wheel carriers, they don't just sit on the side of the track with no tension on them whatsoever. If you were to take the train off the track, you would say that's okay. Let's give you an example. The outside of the track, outside rail to outside rail, is, let's just say, 1,000 millimeters. It's actually kind of common, right? So we'll say it's 1,000 millimeters outside to outside. And then if you measure the inside of the guide wheels, inside to inside, which are going to go on that, it's not 1,000 millimeters. A lot of times that will be 996 or 994. It'll be somewhere in there. You have like 4 to 6 millimeters worth of what's called crush on both sides of the track. And what that does is that takes those wheels, instead of just sitting nice and gentle on the side of that track, and it crushes the wheels to the side, so it has a really tight grip on the track. That helps prevent hunting. You've heard me talk about this before. When the vehicle goes down the track and it starts bumping left to right because it's so heavy, there's so much weight and speed and everything else, when it starts to hunt like that down there, you can decrease the hunting by increasing the crush on those guide wheels. And when those guide wheels are really crushed hard against the track, it doesn't want to hunt anymore. It wants to go straight. Now, you can only do that to a certain point, because as you increase the crush, the train actually goes faster and faster because it's going straighter. At the same time, if you don't have the right friction on the guide wheels and stuff to the track, you will literally melt the guide wheels. So it's not necessarily something you want to do. Track manufacturing tolerances, they also go, the rails aren't perfectly straight. As you go down there, the rails are going in and out like this. The tolerance of the track is going in and out. Some manufacturers are super precise. B&M, I love B&M. Plus or minus 1 millimeter. That's it on the track dimensions. It's plus or minus 1 millimeter. It's actually in their book that if the dimensions ever found over that plus or minus one thing, the entire track element has to be rebuilt. Mainly they're just talking about commissioning on that. You're not just going to go out there one day and measure it and be like, oh, look, it's off. It's got to be redone. It's pretty much from the factory. And mainly where you see that is where the two segments come together, because B&Ms don't use any sort of cone and cup for the rails to lock into each other. They're simply just two flat ends that are pushed next to each other and married like that. They're bolted together. So that's where they say no more than plus or minus 1 millimeter. Now, other manufacturers are not quite that great. They're plus or minus 5 millimeters. It's all over the place. And I know it's like, well, why wouldn't they make that tolerance tighter if everything is so critical to that tolerance? Well, it costs a lot of money and takes a lot of time to do that. Did anyone else just get the idea why B&Ms are so expensive? That's part of it. To make a track that precise, it takes a long time and takes a lot of people with a lot of knowledge and know-how. So the fact that B&M does it is absolutely amazing, that they're able to keep the track tolerance that tight throughout their entire track and structure. Quite amazing. I think Endemans were like plus or minus 3 or 4 millimeters. I know Premier's was like plus or minus quarter inch, I think they said, which I was quite surprised of. We had an LSM ride that was like that much. I was like, what? Amazing the train doesn't hit the stators all the time like that. So track tolerance is a big issue. Wheels to the track is a big issue. So on Hyperia, you probably don't want to adjust the guide wheel tension. You probably want to leave the guide wheel tension exactly where it sits. And those type of rides, I believe they have a control track, which is where they move the train to a certain segment, and they adjust the guide wheels to just 0 play. And then the track is narrower in there, so it has the proper crush once it goes up there. Now, they could experiment with that stuff, but it's not great because it's a lot of passed down knowledge later on that is hard to transmit from one crew to the next, especially over the lifespan of the ride. So that's track tension. So we want to look at the wheel bearings. So what can we do to those wheel bearings? Well, it would take a lot to do. It's not a quick process, but basically you can remove all the wheels on the train, the roads, guides, and upstops, take the bearings all the way apart, clean them, and put them back together with lighter grease on the inside. Now, lots of ride manufacturers specify just in their wheel bearings, they say, hey, we're just going to use MP grease. M is in Mary Paul. MP grease also stands for multi-purpose. So we're going to use multi-purpose grease in those wheels, and it's going to be great. Those wheels run pretty slow. So you can kick it up a notch and say you're going to use high-performance grease, and it will go a little bit faster. The B&M I worked on, and we actually use this all over the park for those wheels, is we use Kluber, which is an excellent product, very expensive, but it's great. So we use Kluber Isoflex Topaz MB52. That was some good grease. We used that in everything. We used that in the SLC, in the Boomerang, in the B&M. We used it. We even tried using it in the Tavali coaster, which used a ton of these guys. That was one of the things where we didn't want to pay the end price tag for that because it was way too expensive. But we used it in pretty much every ride, and we put the same grease in there because it just worked great. So what's the next step? The next step is to go even thinner than that grease. Now, there is another grease made by Kluber, and that is, we consider that was like the high standard. We didn't really use it at the park I was at, but I went to another park and we were talking about stuff, and the engineer showed me, he says, hey, let me show you the gold grease. I was like, what's the gold grease? So they take me over there to the office, and they go into their special lockup, and they pull out these grease tubes. It's Kluber, and it was MB, like the stuff I was used to using was MB52. This stuff was called MB5051, 5051. So 5051, that stuff was like, it was like I was talking about earlier, it was like whipped cream. It was very light, extremely fluffy. It didn't feel like anything in your hands. It was like nothing. And we were like, what is this, assembly? Does this even stand up to anything? And the engineer said, oh, it's the best stuff ever. It holds up under high temperature, to moisture, everything else. And he says, and there's like hardly any friction to it. He said that was the thing that they put all inside of the X2 wheels, because X2 had a ton of wheel bearing issues that they had to get through. So they put that all inside that machine. So that was very interesting to find out. It's like, oh, okay, making it go faster. All right, that's cool. But I was like, why is it called gold grease? Because it was white. The color was white. It looked like whipped cream again. I was like, why gold? He said, because of the price tag. He says it was expensive. It was like holding a tube of gold in your hands. It was like, it was really expensive. They pulled everything out of their inventory, and they did all that stuff. They would sign grease out to rides, and it would go out there and get used. That particular grease, it took I believe he told me it took a lead to go sign out that grease one tube at a time and take it to a ride, and they had to justify using it. So it was like, wow. So anyways, Hyperia, they can go through multiple levels of putting thinner and thinner grease in there to get it to go faster and faster. So that is the biggest suggestion, which would be to lower the grease down, get it to go faster. If it still needs to go faster, it's not great for hunting, but I would actually say to loosen the guide wheel grip to the track. It's going to start hunting more, but the reduction in friction you have to the track is going to be way better. The other thing that does add quite a lot of speed to the ride, especially over there in that area where I know it rains and it's very moist and everything all the time, which would be to apply extra track lube. Now, a lot of places don't like to apply extra track lube because it makes the track messy. It really does. If you ever go along and you see a roller coaster track and then typically down towards a low spot, you see it just turn black all of a sudden and then goes back to looking like a normal color, and this is around the rails. That is where they apply track lube at. Roller coasters, a lot of times you apply track lube at low spots that the mechanics can get to really easy. I would go up there with some track lube and just kind of like use a brush, use something, and just wipe it on the rails in like a good 5, 6, 10 foot spot. And just kind of wipe it on there, and then the train would just pick it up and just carry it through the track. I would apply it to the wheels itself, but typically a lot of that would get just taken off right on the lift hill, which is okay, but the goal wasn't to make the lift greasier than it already was. So we like to put it onto the run track somewhere and let it pick it up down there. But you could loosen the guide wheels and you could apply extra track lube. That will also speed that train up. Another thing which is typically not that common is the hitch assembly. Sometimes the hitches can be run loose, which would take a little bit of bind out of there, but not much. But the thing is, these days, most hitches are like this. Most hitches are a hemispherical type end ball joint that sits there between the coaches. So this would be the front of one coach or the back of one coach, and the other coach basically holds it like this. So the hitch is allowed to go this direction, left and right, and twist at the same time. So it's able to do all that. This type of hitch, you can't loosen this at all. There is no loosen to this. It's the way the manufacturer built it, and it's done. Other types of hitches, like older style Vekoma trains, Aero trains, things like that, where they use a hitch fork and a cardan block and things like that, a 2-axis block, those can be adjusted ever so slightly to loosen them up. It's typically not something you do. The hitches typically aren't a great source of friction, but if you're looking to shave things off, you might want to take the train apart and figure out exactly if the hitch is nice and loose or if it's super bound up. If you have to put a pry bar on a hitch to move it, it's probably too tight. And while we're talking about rides over there on that side of the pond, I think we get the honorable mention of what showed up in that opening beginning, which was the top spin over there. So I'm probably going to butcher this one pretty good. So the ride Talocan at Fantasyland. I'm probably going to get so much hate for this. I apologize in advance. Okay, so it is a Huss top spin. It's nothing out of the ordinary. It's a back-to-back, so it's a later model top spin. But the basic ride principle is the same for that one. Basically, I got sent this video. So what's going on in this video is that, and I've had this happen to me before, the ride is driven, and that center beam that stretches right across the middle on there, that connects the left and the right side. Okay, so on the side of the ride there is a tower sitting there. It's got 2 motors hanging from it, one on the left, one tower on the left, one tower on the right. The 2 motors both turn the same way, whether they're both turning clockwise on the right side and then the left side they both turn counterclockwise to create one uniform motion for the ride. So you have 4 motors working in unison. If you damage any of the 4 motors for any reason whatsoever, you get that wobbly effect, because what happens is 2 motors working properly will suddenly overpower the 1 motor on the other side. And it's like, wait a minute, overpower? They work together. How would you overpower them? Well, the motors have to work in unison with each other. So they all have to have the same input, the same torque, the same movement, and same direction. So the last time that happened to me, where that ride did that exact same thing and went all wobbly and stupid looking on me, was that the Lovejoy coupler, which is a rubber flex coupler, looks like a set of steel fingers like this, and there's another set of steel fingers that come down right on top of each other like that. And then in between those steel fingers, there is a rubber disc that goes in there. It's a rubber coupling. It's a it's a Lovejoy coupler. It's also called a spider coupling on the inside of that. That rubber takes the movement and it takes the flex in the joint and everything else, and it softens everything. Well, what happened to the one I was working on is that those fingers had started to crack. Okay, and because they're in an enclosed box that you can't see inside of there, and we only got up there, I think, on a monthly, if I have that right, and you have to open up the cover or at least stick a bunch of mirrors down inside there to see that coupler all over the place. We didn't see it in time, and what happened is one finger had broken off, and then almost instantly all of them broke off, and it completely sheared the coupling. So what we had suddenly 3 motors working and one that was not. Well, it was trying to work, but it couldn't because it was not turning the gearbox. The motor was just simply going up and spinning in the air because its coupler had broke. So on that guy, what we had was you had 2 motors on, let's just say, the right side, which were working properly and working together. The one motor that was working on the left side was supposed to have its buddy working right next to it to also do the same thing. So if you think about it working in unison, it's like all-wheel drive on a car. You have 4 motors working to turn the gondola one direction. Each motor is putting out, let's just say, this is not the actual way the ride works, but each motor puts out, let's say, 25% power to get 100% power into the track and structure, into the structure of the ride. So in this case, what we had was we had 50% power working on one side, just like it was supposed to, but we only had 25% on the other side. Because of that, when it went to accelerate one direction, pick a direction, in this case it looked like it was going up, but once it went to accelerate, those 2 on the right side said 50% power, go, and it went, yep, and it pushed the arm up there, and the left side said 50% power, go, and it went, yep. It tried to push, but only one motor was doing it. So because of that, that right side arm went up quick, and the left side did not. It was like, whoa, and it started doing this number because the ride was like, uh-oh, something's wrong, and it starts throwing all sorts of warnings and errors out. Says something's wrong, and the thing was just trying to do this. Now, it looks bad on the video because what happened is it had gone up, probably faulted, or the ride operator stopped it really quick, and the gondola is now trying to come back down. So it is trying to come down slowly, but because, again, you have 50% working on one side and 25% working on the other side, even small controlled movements are still hard for it because it's got the counterweights on both sides of the arm, so it's trying to move it down, but the two, essentially, instead of moving down in unison, it's essentially walking itself back down. So you see it go up right when it starts to break is when that video started, because someone was like, either they're already recording or they're just like, the heck is going on with that? And then it got up, and that's when the ride operator is like, uh-oh, hit the stop button. Ours had a foot pedal. Maybe they took their foot off the pedal, if that's the way theirs is set up. And then the ride went up and it said, okay, stop, bring it back down. And then it started to come back down all uneven like that. Now, there's nothing really too wrong with that in there. Those rides are built to do that exact same thing. So up at the very top, that big long beam that stretches left to right, that beam is actually a drive shaft. It's a connection shaft that links the left side and the right side. They also have big couplers in there, big rubber flex couplers that allows the sides to torsion. Now, if you think about 2 big, long, straight arms connected in the center, and then you start doing this number to it, what's everyone say? It's going to tear the gondola in half. What the heck? You can't do that. Topspin's already thought about that. On the one side of the gondola, if you look midway up the arm, you'll see this big, round connection point. Looks kind of like a giant pin running through the arm. It is a pin running through the arm. One arm is solid. It doesn't do anything. It simply just goes like this with the ride. It rotates with the ride. The other arm, however, is not solid. It also rotates like this, but right about here, this would be upside down because the gondola would be on top. Right about here, there is a giant pin that goes through it, and the whole arm is allowed to do this number. Why would you want that to do that? Because when the arms don't align with each other and they go like this, well, that measurement gets too big and you can't have that. So the measurement has to lengthen somehow. How are you going to lengthen the gondola? You can't do that. So you put that hinge in there, and when one side tries to pull the gondola up like that, the other side starts to hinge in a little bit to allow that gondola to go crooked and up there. Now, like, that can't be good for anything else. It's not great for it, don't get me wrong. It's not something that should be done repetitively. But in the gondola, there are giant cone rubber bushings, right, where those two arms attach into there for that purpose. Because although this was very exaggerated and the arms were going all over the place and everyone's like, that guy's drunk. Yeah, as it was doing that, this also happens on a very small level every single cycle. Every single cycle it does it because of the dynamic loading in the structure. So you get a bunch of heavy people sitting on one side, a bunch of little light kids, or maybe nobody on the other side. 4 motors still have to fight it out. It's going to behave differently. It's going to do this just at a much smaller scale. With the 4 motors working properly, the scale is very small. They stay very close to each other. So with the 4 motors working properly, the thing works like this, and everything goes as when it comes to stop, when it holds the brakes, when it does its top spin, when it does the flip. It does this number, but it's doing it very small. It's doing it in a very narrow little space. But all that stuff, those big rubber bushings, and then that hinge pin in there in that one arm, is all designed specifically just to allow that to happen. So I think that's enough for this video. We talked about, let's recap, we talked about trying to speed Hyperia up. Again, my particular thought is to simply put lighter grease in the wheel bearings and send that around and see what happens, because that thing runs way too slow. Those videos I saw, like, ooh, that's a heart attack each time I saw that thing run. It's like, ooh, it's going to valley, it's going to valley. And it valleyed. And then we went over the top spin over there. I'm not going to butcher that name a second time. I apologize. We talked about the top spin, and I said that's probably just a broken motor coupler that I'm assuming is just a quick repair. We had other couplers standing by, although ours was a pain in the butt to work on. We had to use a man lift to get to it each time, which that one doesn't look like a cakewalk to work on either, but it's doable. But that is the reason that gondola would get all out of whack and crazy looking to see that sort of stuff. So anyways, I think that's about done for this video. I'm Ryan the Ride Mechanic. If you haven't already, make sure you like, subscribe, do all that stuff downstairs. It does help me out. If you want to email me, you can email me at ryantheridermechanic@yahoo.com. I typically try to respond when I can. I get a lot of people messaging me and emailing me all the time, so I get backed up from time to time as well. And let's see, gone over all the plugs. Oh yeah, stay off the air gates. Bye.